Okay, come on in, folks. And we're going to pick back up in Esther chapter 1. So, Xerxes is king, also known as Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is his Hebrew spelling. Xerxes is the Greek spelling. And, of course, we're seeing everything after it gets brought into English. And then there was a different Persian spelling. But the same guy, Xerxes the first. I had some questions last week about the history again, so just going to recap that briefly. Esther chapter 1 is set in the third year of the reign of Ahasuerus, the reign of Xerxes, which would be probably 483 BC. I shared with you a couple weeks ago that when we talk about these histories in this period of time, sometimes might be off by a year because so much of the history is recorded with reference to the first year or the second year or the third year of such and such a king. And are we counting a full calendar year? Are we starting over at the beginning of the new year? How do we reckon all this? And so there's some uncertainty there, but probably 483 is his third year. And then 483. And then that's when we have this banqueting and this celebrating and this drunkenness that we had last week. And the king gets angry at Queen Vashti. We'll unpack that more in a minute. Then from the secular histories of the period, we know that shortly thereafter, Xerxes, Ahasuerus, was off to war against the Greeks. Ultimately, it didn't go well. It was an ill-advised attempt to get bigger than what he needed to be. But that happens in the intervening years, quite possibly during all this banqueting that we have in Esther 1, when he has all of his advisors and people in town, all of his military officials. They were planning for this military campaign against Greece. But anyway, somewhere 481, 479 BC is your campaign against Greece, which ended poorly. And according to the secular historians, on the way back from that campaign, Amystress, who is the queen of Xerxes according to the secular histories, Amystress gives Xerxes a robe. We're not quite sure why she gives him a robe. But we do know that he gives that robe to a niece trying to solicit a romantic affair with her. And Amystress catches wind of this, and she is violently angry against the niece and the niece's mother with whom Xerxes has already had an affair. And so after that point in history, that robe incident, the robe sequence there, Amystress disappears from the secular histories. She reappears later as the queen mother in the days of Artaxerxes, her son, also Xerxes' son. So there is a falling out of favor of Amystress that may or may not dovetail with this falling out of favor of Vashti that we see in the biblical record. I cannot prove to you that Amystress is Vashti, neither can I disprove it to you. It is a possibility for those of us who are inclined to think that Esther is much more of a based on a true story type of thing than a historical fiction type of thing. So anyway, that's what happens with Amystress in the meantime. And then the seventh year of his reign, Esther chapter 2, verse 16, the seventh year is when Esther becomes, his replacement for Vashti, and that would be after he gets back from that war, 479. So one of the historical questions about Esther is how can this be happening if Xerxes is off to war, but actually there's ample gap between chapters 1 and 2, the third year and the seventh year, for the war with Greece to happen in there. The war with Greece is simply not of interest to our author of Esther, is probably the simplest explanation for that. So there's a little bit of your history. And then remember, as I said last week, after Xerxes dies, his son Artaxerxes I becomes king. And that is your era of Ezra, Nehemiah, and probably Malachi. So these are your last characters of the Old Testament, last characters of the OT. Any questions, comments about Persian history? Okay. We can talk more about that later if you want to. Let's pick back up where we ended last week. By the way, last week I want credit for this. This rarely happens in Wednesday morning Bible study. But I only advertised the first 9 verses last week, and we actually read the first 12. But just to make sure we're not going too fast, we're going to reread 10 through 12 today to set the scene. So remember, a big party has been happening for all of the king's men, and Vashti's having a separate party for the women. And so verses 10 through 12. Who would like to read that? Esther 1, Esther 1, verses 10 through 12.
On the seventh day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he took 7 eunuchs who attended him
Just nail them. Just make it up and go after them.
Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abgatha, Zethar, and Carthage,
Great.
to bring Queen Vashti to him with a royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to give her meat beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. And when they conveyed the king's orders to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned angry.
Okay, thank you, Isaiah. So this is the seventh day of the king's feasting. So in some sense, he had 180 days, says the text, a half a year of flouting his wealth and riches, culminating with this 7-day feast that apparently is not only for his political brass and his military leaders and that sort of thing, but also men from all ranks of society are together. And the most important thing you need to know about Xerxes' banquet is they were drinking a lot of alcoholic beverages. That is the most important thing you need to know. And so our opening line there in verse 10 is that Ahasuerus, his heart was merry with wine. And if your heart is merry with wine in the Bible, that is not a flattering comment. You do not want to be merry with wine. The Bible, of course, does not outright condemn the consumption of wine. Even Jesus turned water into wine. But when your heart gets merry with wine, we have turned a corner here, and this is not where you want to be. And he grabs his 7 eunuchs. Remember, eunuchs are your biologically modified males who are working for the king. And they have a list of 7 names here, and Hosea, like the rest of us, kind of stumbled through that list, but that's part of the point, actually. My understanding is these lists of 7. You have 7 eunuchs here in verse 11 or verse 10. You're going to have 7 advisors a little bit later on in the chapter. These were kind of like the lists in Daniel chapter 3. So remember Daniel chapter 3, the story of Nebuchadnezzar and his statue? You know, after that dream that Daniel interprets for him about, you're like part of a statue, it's going to fall down. Nebuchadnezzar decides the best thing he can do is go out and make a statue of himself and command the rest of his people to worship him, And anyway, in that statue story in Daniel chapter 3, we have several maculatory lists of all of the officials who are going to bow down before this statue and all the instruments they're going to play. And the author is having a fun time mocking Nebuchadnezzar for his arrogance by going through all of the people and all the instruments that are going to be involved in this worship of Nebuchadnezzar. And it's supposed to make him look silly. So we have the same kind of thing here with these lists of 7 names, which apparently are even funnier sounding in Hebrew than they are in English. And so the well-versed reader of the Old Testament and Hebrew would be chuckling along during these lists of all the clumsily named eunuchs. And he sends 7 of them to get the queen. How many eunuchs does it take to get the queen? That's just a great question, Usually when I want to send a message to somebody, I say, hey, will you go tell so-and-so? And I just need one person to take care of that. But this is part of the patronizing nature of this whole shenanigan, is that he is sending 7 eunuchs to go bring Queen Vashti. And why does he want Queen Vashti to come in?
To show her off.
To show her off. She's pretty to look at. That's what the text says. She's pretty to look at. And so, come on in. Remember, the king has been showing off his wealth, his riches, and he's like, hey, the best trophy I have is my wife. So you 7 men, go get her and tell her to come. I want to show her off to my crowd of drunken men from all sectors of society. This is not a flattering offer to Vashti. This is not a great opportunity. It is possibly a dangerous opportunity for her. We don't know. Some of the commentators have speculated how risque this was, how vulnerable she was to being taken advantage of. We don't know for sure, but even at its base level, without reading much into it, this is not a great opportunity for Queen Vashti. And so her answer is what? Her answer is no. Now, usually when my wife says no, I just kind of leave it at that. We're good. That's just the answer is no. And that's probably the way most of the husbands in this room operate too. But apparently this does not go over well with the very drunken Queen Ahasuerus, Xerxes, and so he is very furious at the end of verse 12. Why? This is a great question to ask, because we can learn a lot about our own anger by looking at the anger of people in the Bible. But why is Ahasuerus, why is Xerxes so angry? Why is he so angry? He didn't get his way. That's right. He's the head honcho, right? Right. Yeah. He's the king. Everybody's got to do what I say. This guy is king from, as we said, the Nile region to the Indus River. So he's got like the whole known world is under his thumb, except for Greece. That didn't work so well. But I mean, he's got basically everywhere. He's got all this power, all this authority, and of all people, his wife has the audacity to say no to him. This is an honor-shame thing. Honor and shame is an especially big deal in most of the biblical cultures. And so he has been shamed. This whole sequence of events and banquets designed to puff him up and make him look wealthy and powerful is now making him suddenly look very, very weak and pathetic, and he is not happy about it.
Nathan,
Yes.
one of my footnotes that I hadn't heard this till this morning was that she could be pregnant, possibly pregnant. Well, if
Interesting.
she was, I mean, that would even be worse that he wanted to show her off because
Yes.
she could get hurt.
Yeah. I don't know. So Sherry's footnote says that she may have been pregnant. I don't know. I did not come across that speculation yet, but certainly that would only add to the thing. I'd be interested to dig into that more. I've tried to get a fairly wide cross-section of Hebrew scholars to dig into this with. So anyway, they didn't think about that. Yes. Yes, Xerxes is the Greek name for Ahasuerus, which is the Hebrew name for the Persian name, which I will not attempt to pronounce for you just now. But that's one of the weird things is how names come through languages, and we don't all have the same letters and ways of pronouncing stuff. But yeah, Xerxes is Ahasuerus is the king of Persia. So you have Nebuchadnezzar is the guy when the Babylonian exile comes, and so the Jews in multiple rounds are hauled out of Judah and off to Babylon. And then after Nebuchadnezzar, we work on down through a few different kings. Belteshazzar is the son of the king, but is effectively acting as king in the days of Daniel down near the end. And he, of all things, is having a drunken banquet. And then the next day, lo and behold, the Persians come in. And Cyrus the Great is the guy who's the first Persian, real worldwide kind of leader. And he's the one who allows some of the Jews to begin going back home and rebuild the temple, this sort of thing. There's a few other Persian kings, and then we get on down to Ahasuerus, Xerxes here. He's known better as Xerxes because it's the Greek histories that tell us more about the period. But yeah, he is the Persian king at this point. So he's mad. He's very angry, and I think sometimes we get angry not so much because we've been wronged, but because we didn't get our way, because we've been made to look bad. And so that helps us to consider our own anger. When am I angry because it was actually an issue of right and wrong? And when am I angry simply because it makes me look bad or I didn't get what I wanted? And so I think Xerxes invites us to reflect on ourselves with that. So what is the angry king going to do? Let's read verses 13 through 15. And when you get to that list of advisors close to the king, just read it with great confidence and we won't question you. Go for it, Randy. Esther 1, verses 13 through 15.
Then the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. And next unto him was Carshena, Sheatar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marcina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat first in the kingdom. 15, right?
Through 15.
What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to the law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king?
King Xerxes or Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus, maybe you have it? Yeah.
By the chamberlains.
Okay, very good. So he brings in all of his legal experts who understand the times. Some of the scholars understand the phrase understood the times to mean maybe astrologers who study the stars understand the times. That's a maybe, maybe not. At any rate, they're familiar with matters of law and justice. What is the appropriate legal response to my wife who has defied me at my banquet of drunken fools? That's basically, what'd you say?
30 lashes.
Yeah, and it's not 30 lashes, right? So what is the appropriate legal response? I'm bringing my experts. So the laws of Persia are important both to Daniel and Esther. One of the things that both Daniel and Esther tell us that we find nowhere else in histories of this era of time is that the laws of Persia were in some sense irrevocable or unchangeable. Now, there's some skepticism among some of the historians saying, well, that really wouldn't be a way to run an empire. But I think that there's some merit to that way of thinking, especially because the Bible tends to show us that political power is inherently trapping. The Bible tends to show us that political power is inherently trapping. You become trapped by the very power which you wield. We see some examples of this in the case of Pilate and others. But I think especially Jesus' comment about gaining the whole world and forfeiting your very self in the process. And so one of the things that's supposed to make a Persian king powerful is that his word is what the way it is. And that's the way it always is, and you can't change it. And yet we find multiple times that the decrees of these kings become inherently trapping for themselves. And so the law of Persia becomes a big deal in Esther, but the law itself ends up being not an example of the king's power, but actually an exposure of the king's weakness. So that's just kind of one of your underlying themes here all the way on through Esther. His law, which is supposed to be so great, is actually trouble for him. Nevertheless, let's bring in the lawyers to discuss what to do with my defiant wife, keeping in mind that no one in this group is probably abstained from wine in the previous several days. So that goes into the thinking as well. 7 from Persia and Media who are close to him. As I said before last week, the Medes and the Persians are very closely related politically and ethnically, and so they're often lumped together here. Some of his very greatest and best who are close to him. What is the legal response to Queen Vashti? She has not obeyed the command of the king that the eunuchs delivered to her. So that's who we've brought in. We're going to see what all the king's wise men say. Sometimes wise men aren't that wise, by the way. That's one of the points of Scripture as well. Any questions about that little blurb before we go in to figure out what they advise? All right. Verses 16 through 20 here. Memucan is one of the advisors. Bill will read this for us. Esther 1, verses 16 through 20.
Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the people of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all of the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the law of the Persian and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest.
Never underestimate the potential for a bunch of drunken men to get together and come up with a really bad idea. And that's right. And that's what we have here. So Memucan says Queen Vashti's wrong is not just against the king. Who has she sinned against?
All the nobles.
Yes, all the noble men of Persia, who have been quite noble in recent days, by the way, with their behavior. So all of the men of Persia have been sinned against. And when what she does becomes known to all the other ladies of the empire, what are they going to do? They're going to revolt against their husbands. Oh, we have a crisis. The women might get out of control, say the men, who are manifestly already out of control.
The women the right to vote.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you never know what's going to happen, right? So, anyway, so they decide, the problem here is the women, what the women might do. And really the problem is we might lose control. If the king can't keep his wife in line, then the rest of us have much more hope than that. So that really is the line of thinking here. And so what does Memucan say the king ought to do?
Banish her.
Yeah, banish her. Make a decree that she gets banished, and what else happens? She gets replaced with the effect that all of the women will respect their husbands, Now think about this. Persia is a relatively wide empire at this point, from the Nile to the Indus. And we have this event that has happened in the capital at Susa, one of 4 capitals, by the way. You know, it's not good enough to have one castle. We got 4 of these places. But anyway, probably it's safe to say that most of the women in the empire are not aware of this event, right? And if we don't make like a public decree and send it out to the whole empire, most women are probably going to remain unaware of this event. So actually what we're doing here is going to make them all very aware of this event that many of them probably would not have had any idea it happened from the first place. But again, I have not been drinking, so I can think through these things. So make a decree, banish Vashti from your presence. Notice she gets banished but not killed, so she's still around. So that allows for the possibility of our theory that she might be Artaxerxes' mother who comes back around later on. But banish her, replace her with someone else, and then proclaim the verdict throughout the land so that all the women will respect their husbands. I just want the women in the room to help me with this. If you were living in an empire like this, and you found out that the king, prime minister, president, czar, dictator, supreme high leader, Führer, whatever, you found out that his wife disobeyed him and that he got mad at her and banished her and replaced her with somebody else, how would that improve your relationship with your husband? I'm just missing that, so I don't think that maybe Mimican understands women very well. Yes, Karen.
You cannot force someone to respect you.
You can't force someone to respect you. Yeah. You can get some outward submission, but you can't force someone to respect you inwardly here. This is a great example. I was talking with Karen about this beforehand, but this is a great example of something that we've seen happen all the way from the level of government down to church policy, where an event happens, and we, without thinking super clearly, really overact that event, and we make a new policy, a new rule, a new law to combat that event, to make sure it never happens again. And yet the very thing we put into writing is not actually enforceable. It can't actually be done. We've tried to make ourselves feel better by encoding this thing into law, but it hasn't actually guaranteed that what just happened won't happen again. In fact, my thinking might be that more of the women would be inclined to be more rebellious toward their husbands if the king is going to be so hoity-toity about this whole thing. So anyway, the women will respect their husbands, says Mimican, from the least of them to the greatest. We're going to bring the women of Persia into line. Verses 21 through 22, who'd like to end the chapter here. 21 and 22 of Esther chapter 1. Steve on the second row, please.
The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Mimican proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province and in its own script, and to each people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be the ruler over his own household.
All right, this is one of the things we know that is historically faithful to the period. We know the Persians had a pretty good road and postal system. So before the Pony Express, you have the Persian Express, I guess. And they were good at dispatching word like this. There will be multiple times in the book of Esther where this system is taken advantage of to get the word out quickly, to let the whole empire know about what has happened. And this is being in each person's language or tongue. The last of those phrases is a little bit nebulous what it means. It looks, by one way of interpreting the text, it looks like the men are supposed to tell their wives in their own languages what has happened, which I'm assuming that, you've got this assimilation of people from lots of cultures in Persia. I'm assuming the people are not normally speaking Persian. They don't have to. They're going to speak whatever language that they grew up with back home before they came here. But anyway, the point is, it's going to go out in every language so that no one will misunderstand. To every burg in the entire empire, every person from every ethnicity is going to get this language so that it is in no uncertain terms that the queen has been banished and will be replaced in Xerxes' presence. And the goal of this decree, probably not the content, probably the goal, is that every man should be ruler over his own household. We're going to bring the women into line. Other impressions from Esther chapter 1, yes.
I have two things. The first is just my translation in verse 21. Says the king and his nobles thought this made good sense.
Yes,
I think
yeah.
It's kind of ironic.
The king and his nobles thought this made good sense. So this is one of our questions about Ahasuerus, Xerxes, that we want to ask about ourselves, what makes for a good idea? What is the measure of a good idea, a wise idea, a right idea? What are the sources of a good idea, and who is the arbiter of a good idea, what it is and is not? Because the thing is, what you'll see with Xerxes repeatedly is he does not come up with his own ideas, and ideas are good if they seem pleasing to him. And I'm thinking again about the book of Judges, and alarm bells are going off. In those days, Israel had no king. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And what is right as far as Xerxes is concerned is whatever's pleasing in his own eyes. And that's what happens here. Why did this happen? Not because Memucan said it, but because the king was pleased with it. If the king likes the idea, it's going to happen, whether it's a good idea or not. You got another point there, I think, as well?
Well, the other thing I was gonna say, you mentioned that Vashti just gets banished, and obviously later in Esther, Esther's concerned about losing her life if she goes to the king or whatever.
Mhm.
And it makes me wonder if these nobles sense that Xerxes had a little bit of fondness maybe for his queen in some sense, like especially because later it's gonna talk about how he remembered her or whatever.
Yeah.
And again, I mean, who knows, just speculation, but it makes me wonder, like, why didn't they just say, kill her, when they could?
That's a great question. Why is Vashti not killed at this point? Why is she not executed? Her banishment is from the king's presence, but there's no indication she got banished from the empire. Hard to banish someone from your empire, by the way, when your empire is basically the whole known world. It becomes very difficult to get rid of someone under this circumstance because you're in control of everything anyway. But why was she not executed? Did Xerxes Ahasuerus have some fondness for Vashti? We're going to see maybe a hint of that in the next chapter.
Or she had this child who's gonna be the next king.
Yeah, if she was pregnant, possibly. Yeah, possibly. That's why. That may be part of the theory behind Sherry's footnote there. Yes, Randy.
I think probably even the most corrupt men can have some good in them.
Yeah, he's a corrupt guy. Maybe he has some goodness in him. We don't know. There is no spelling out of why Vashti is not executed here. Yeah, it would kind of ruin the rest of the story. Yes.
Remember, the king put the pressure on the nobles to make the decision.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. The nobles. Yeah.
going out and saying, well, you gotta kill the queen isn't
Right.
exactly the safest thing.
No. So the nobles may have been gun shy on suggesting the death of the queen. The other thing is the nobles seem to take this as a threat to themselves. My goodness, if the king's wife won't stay in line, are our wives going to obey us? The concern, as it turns out, is not whether all of the women of the empire are going to rebel against their husbands. The concern is whether the nobles' wives are going to rebel against them. It's not really, again, back to so many laws are not really about everybody else. So many laws are about the group of people that are making the laws. Yes, Liz.
Well, and going off the first thing, it also makes me think about when later on with Haman and Esther at the banquet or whatever, it's, the threat of Esther's death or life to the king makes him upset or whatever.
Interesting,
It
yeah,
could be,
yeah.
maybe it's not a fondness, it's just
Yeah.
this is one of my possessions or one of my belongings, and you
Yeah.
don't wanna.
Yeah. So Liz is saying later on, when Esther's death becomes a real prospect, the king is very angry about that. He gets angry a lot. The king gets angry a lot. But he's not happy at all about the queen dying. He's got some measure of, I'll say, love for her. When I talk about Xerxes' love or Xerxes' fondness for his wives, I'm not sure if I mean that in the sense that you would actually want anyone to fall in love with you. I think it seems to be more of a possession-oriented, what she can do for me, pleasure-wise oriented, beauty-oriented, and maybe not so much. I just love her character. What do you say?
Almost loves her like a pet.
Yeah, loves her like a pet or an object. Yes, Bill.
Couple of things. A lot of marriages back then were arrangements made between nations of
Yep.
the queen having some relation with somebody else that she was the daughter of some other high official or some land or something. So having her killed may have not been a wise decision.
There you go. Yeah, that's a good point, Bill. Okay.
Political issue
Right. So Bill is bringing up something that is actually going to come to bear later when we actually choose Esther as a replacement. But a lot of marriages in the ancient world, and even now, and as far as royalty, are politically determined. We're doing this for political reasons. So maybe Vashti comes from a background where it would be a bad deal to kill her because it's going to tick somebody else off part of the way. You know, one of the things that the scholars say about this period of history is that there was, again, one of these other great laws of the Persians, that the Persian king was supposed to take his wife from among one of 7 noble families. And so one of the strikes against Esther from a historical perspective, from those who scrutinize it, is that, well, Esther does not fit that description of being from one of the 7 noble families. However, we know that Xerxes' daddy, Darius, also had at least one wife who wasn't from the 7 noble families. So here's the thing. These laws of the Persians are supposed to be unbreakable, except for the kings, because they can kind of break them if they want to break them. And so that happens then and now in different ways. And so getting Esther in this way, that's one thing that's going to look silly about this whole how to replace Vashti conversation, is there theoretically are some established ways of doing this, but let's come up with this new way of doing this, the advisors will tell the king. Other comments about chapter 1? Yes, Bill?
And to follow on with Karen's comment a while ago, that you could command respect, basically.
Right.
You know, having worked, and Steve knows and others knows that being in the military organization, having worked in military organizations, it's
Now I can see Bill when he
there are a lot
talks.
of times with the military that you respect the position greatly, but the individual that's in that position
Right.
doesn't always command as great a
Right.
respect because
Right.
of their actions.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there were public works officers and there were captains praying.
Right.
A lot of people really, they respected the position, but they didn't have a great deal of respect.
Sometimes you have to respect the position, but you don't really respect the character that's in the position. And clearly the author of Esther does not want us to have a positive view of King Ahasuerus. That's not a good thing. Yes, Sandy?
I don't know if it's the same set of eunuchs that went, but the eunuchs were in charge of the harem.
Yeah, well, yes. I think there's lots of eunuchs
So,
are
I
orbiting
don't
around
know
the
if
queen.
it's one, but
Yeah.
The eunuchs that were in charge of the harem, that was their job to take care of them and stuff. And so if they see this as really, really awful, they might have issued what was said, but
Okay, so the eunuchs are not consulted for the decision-making process here. So you got multiple chunks of eunuchs. You got all kinds of eunuchs in a kingdom like this. So you got eunuchs in charge of the queen. And then you got eunuchs in charge of the harem, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then you had these advisors, these legal experts, supposedly, who came up with this brilliant legislation, against Queen Vashti. So you got different groups here. And so it's a little bit blurry, but we do know from other evidence from the period that the king having 7 advisors is not an unusual thing. Was there more to your point there, Sandy? You guys?
well, more relationship with Vashti, that when they deliver the order,
Uh-huh.
it's like you're saying the words, but you're saying the king wants you to go to the palace and
Right.
it's not what it's
Okay, yes. So perhaps the eunuchs themselves were encouraging Vashti. Here's the situation you're about ready to walk into, and they may have you. And I don't know. I don't know how the eunuchs swayed or didn't sway in this situation. But Vashti makes a call that I think we can certainly understand, although at great risk to herself. Saying no to the king is not a great.
You gotta remember that the experts in the law are still a tad inebriated.
Yes, the experts in the law are a tad inebriated, in more than a tad, in Esther chapter 1.
Well, I kind of thought back then, the women were subservient to the men anyway. I mean, I wouldn't have thought that they could assert anything really in the household.
Well, neither did the king. Right? The king didn't think that his wife would assert anything. He said, everything else has gone my way for this whole period of time. I've been showing off my wealth and my riches and my greatness. And, this great banquet I've had. So why wouldn't this go my way too? So this is really scandalous. And I think this reveals something about our anger, right? The more spoiled we are, the more angry we become when suddenly we don't get what we want. The more spoiled we are and the more arrogant we become, which is certainly the king here, the easier it is for us to become angry when the least little thing doesn't go our way. You ever think about that? We have so many things. Just just by virtue of technology alone. We have so many things that go our way and then this one little thing doesn't work. I'm so used to the internet being instant that when it's slow, I'm like scandalized. What's going on? So when I get my will so much of the time, all of a sudden I don't get my will. That really heightens my sense of anger. What is wrong with the world? I didn't get what I wanted. I didn't get it right now. So that may or may not reflect poorly on our culture.
Mary's point is a good one too, men kind of ruled their wives in that
Right.
society, right? So what
Right.
exactly
Right.
is
In a patriarchal world, what good does it do to say women submit to your husbands? They're already doing it, right? I mean, that's that's part of the deal here is, just ridiculousness. The whole chapter 1 is supposed to look ridiculous. It's just supposed to make the king look ridiculous, his advisor ridiculous, and unnecessary. And their actions are only going to make the women want to be more like Vashti and not less like Vashti. So, and the whole thing becomes known. It wouldn't be known if they didn't make this decree. Just take the punch and roll with it, king, and nobody will know about this thing. Yeah.
But also in the Old Testament, the Jewish Hebrew custom was women were subservient. But then part of the stuff from the different prophets talked about how the women were like the fattened cows of Bashan and all those things. So there was still some issues within the society of women being able to get their own way. And so, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure that that's always 100% true.
Well, yeah, and I don't know what I said or what you thought I said.
And you said that women were subservient, and yes, they were, but maybe not as much.
Well,
totally.
yeah. So it would be an unfair gloss of all the biblical history to say that women were always subservient to their men. I mean, that we have some individual women who are obviously some significant players and that sort of thing. But in general, in the ancient Persian world, the men get to do whatever they want, whether they ought to be able to or not. And so, in general, this is a tremendous overreaction to try to make a decree to decree what is probably effectively already happening anyway. I'm assuming that the women have a fair amount of independence in the domestic sphere as far as things that happen in their part of the household operations in a lot of cases. Keep in mind, the Persian Empire is a very diverse empire at this point. Lots of cultures, lots of values, lots of ways of relating. But to make a decree with the goal that the women would respect their husbands is superfluous and redundant, and as Karen said, and to your point as well, is not really going to actually garner real respect. But yeah, it would be a gloss to simply say that every woman in the ancient world nodded along with her husband all the time. That would not be fair. But by and large, the men got to do what they wanted sooner or later, and so that's just kind of the way the world was, and maybe in many ways still is. So, all right, so let's go to chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. And Delene, please.
After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what had been decided regarding her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king." And may the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, and have them bring every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, and to the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them. And let the young woman who pleases the king be the queen in place of Vashti. And the suggestion pleased the king, and he did so.
Oh boy, here we go. So later, we don't know how much later. There's kind of wild and wide-ranging debate about how much later, although I'm assuming that this is in the same era as the latter part of chapter 2, which is identified as happening in the 7th year of his reign. So we've had a gap of a few years, probably, the way that I'm following the markers of the text. But later on at some point, he's not as angry as he once was. And the king, it says, remembered Vashti. Normally, when this expression is used in the Old Testament, the Lord remembered so-and-so, it's an expression of compassion. It's an expression of about ready to act on behalf of the one or the ones whom I've remembered. So normally, the Lord remembers so-and-so. He's getting ready to act and intervene on someone's behalf. So when we have this kind of language, you get the idea that maybe Xerxes is starting to have a little bit of remorse for what he has said and done about Vashti. I can't prove that, but usually remembered in this case, his anger is excited and remembered. It's not that he remembers and gets angry all over again. So possibly the king is having the blues, and he's either playing the blues or a country song about his little dilemma that he has now, because he got drunk and made a decree that he wishes he hadn't made. And so something about this has happened, and he's remembering what she had done and what had been decreed about her. Notice actually, the NIV messes this up. In the Hebrew text, it is what had been decreed about her. The NIV cleans it up and says what he had decreed about her. But in the Hebrew text, he's trying to absolve himself from blame. This decree that has been made about my wife, well, you were the one that brought in all your advisors and said, what should I do? And said, sounds good to me. So we find a king here who not only doesn't make his own decisions and only makes decisions based on what sounds good in the moment, but that later on distances himself from the very decisions that he himself has made. This will be the same thing when Mordecai and Haman are involved with these decrees. He'll distance himself from his own responsibility in the decrees we know he was involved in. But you get the idea that maybe here he's having a little measure of regret, possibly, about what he has decreed about Vashti and what she had done. So the king is in a bad mood. What do the king's personal attendants, probably a new group, probably different from the advisors and different from the eunuchs of the queen and different from the eunuchs who take care of the harem. These close advisors of the king notice that the king is sad, and they come up with a proposal to try to raise the king's spirits. And what is this proposal in verse 2? What's the proposal? What are we going to do, king? Yeah, we're going to get all of the beautiful young virgins from the empire. And of course, we take that advisedly here. We're not going to get every virgin in the entire empire of Persia into Susa. But we're going to get a whole bunch of beautiful young women to come for the king. And then what are we going to do with them? Verse 3. We're going to bring them where? Into the harem at Susa. And they're going to be put under the care of Haggai. I love this. Haggai's job description, in charge of the women. So I'm thinking about Haggai's resume later on down the line. From this year to this year, I was in charge of the women. My goodness, what a job. Anyway, Haggai, the king's eunuch, in charge of, the eunuch in charge of women. Good luck, pal. Anyway, this is his job. And he is going to administer what process? At the very end of verse 3, what's he going to do with these women? Yes, he's going to be in charge of beauty treatments. He's going to beautify these already beautiful young virgins from throughout the empire who are going to come and spend some time with the king. Then verse 4, let the girl who pleases the king, remember that's all that matters in Persia, what pleases the king. Let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And what did the king think of this advice? It pleased him. I get to sleep with all the beautiful women of my empire. What a great plan, And all of a sudden, the extremely shallow Ahasuerus is very pleased about this plan. And suddenly, so you can tell how deeply he cares for Vashti, right? Suddenly, forget her. Look what happens to me, So this is the comedy that is the king of Persia. How old is Xerxes? That's a great question. I don't know. I need to look and see how old he was.
What I'm getting at is that if you're rounding up all young, specifically young virgins,
Right.
goats sitting on the throne,
Right. That's right. How young are the virgins and how old is the goat on the throne is the question. So what we do know is, your reign of Xerxes, Ahasuerus, is probably 486 or 485 BC to about 465. So he's at least going to live for, at this point, 13 more years, So he's death minus 13 at this point. But again, I don't know that he dies of old age. He could have died from one of the other reasons. I need to do some research on that. I don't know how old he was. But it's safe to say these women are younger than he is. No question. Yeah, no question. How much younger, I can't speculate. But yeah, there could well be quite a gap there. So this is a good deal for him. 518, the birth. So that would put us, 8 is 10 years, 98 is 20 years, 30. So he went 30s on the throne. So in his 40s now, in his 40s.
So taking
Yeah.
this new queen has the potential to shift the whole lineage thing, right? Like successors and all.
Yeah.
So-
Right. Yeah, this queen decision is a big deal because it does determine lineage, which is why he's supposed to confine his interest to 7 possible families of nobility. But the king's interests are wider than that. No, the vetting process will be who pleases the king when she spends the night with him. And as I said last week, it's not because she brought this great movie she rented from Blockbuster and their popcorn was better than the other one. I mean, there's going to be, a sexual encounter here with every one of these young ladies. And such pressure here on these women, who are going to have to prove themselves over against all these other beautiful women. They're going to have to stand out. The experience he has with each one is going to have to stand out from the rest if he's going to call on her again. So socially, this is horrible for these women. This is not, ooh, I got selected for the Miss America pageant. This is, I am being summoned to the king's harem, like it or not, ready or not, here you come. Summoned to the king's harem, beautified so that I can be, a great accessory for my night I spend with him. And once that's done, I go back into his harem, and I don't go back home again because I'm damaged goods now, right? I'm not going to be marriageable back home now. So I am captive in the palace. And this is like Kurt Flood's book, A Well-Paid Slave. But I'm now captive in the palace, and I really hope that maybe the king will call on me again. But other than that, my life is just kind of like a high-class misery now. So this is not a glamorous situation for these women that are called in, because the vast majority...
They're taken care of.
Yeah, well, they'll be taken care of, but they don't have any of the rest of life that could happen for them, This is also a bad deal. It's a bad deal for the men back home, Imagine the high school crush, this guy has on this girl, and then she gets swept away to Susa to be in the king's harem. And that heartbreaking stories happen all over. Now they're singing the blues, right, throughout Persia. But this is not a way of operating that takes in mind the well-being of the rest of the empire. This is a way of operating that takes in mind the pleasure of the king. And once again, how is Persia ruled? What pleases Xerxes? And that's it. Is it a good idea to go fight the Greeks? No. But these kind of things are happening. So that's the way Ahasuerus operates. So let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. Once again, he doesn't come with his own ideas, right? He gets advisors to tell him what he should do. And he sounds good to me. And he followed it. And that is, not a good idea. Verses 5 through 7, let's meet our other main characters before we close today. Esther 2, verses 5 through 7, Hosea. Thank you.
At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and was a descendant of Kish and Shimei. His family had been among those who, with King
Jehoiakim.
Jehoiakim of Judah, had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar.
Keep going through verse 7. Yeah.
This man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter.
Okay, so Mordecai we meet here. What do we learn about Mordecai? What do we learn about Mordecai in this paragraph?
He's taking care of his relative's child.
Okay, he has adopted his cousin Esther as his own daughter because her mom and dad had died. What else? Which makes her an orphan, by the way. And what else do we learn about Mordecai here? He's Jewish. He's from Judah. Specifically, he's from the tribe of Benjamin. And look at his ancestors' names there, like the name Kish, for example. This is echoing particularly that he is from the same group as King Saul. Go to 1 Samuel 9 real quick. I'll read this in the interest of time. 1 Samuel 9. the opening of 1 Samuel 9. Samuel the prophet has been tasked reluctantly with grabbing this first king of Israel. I'm going to read it for you now, 1 Samuel 9. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, son of Zeror, the son of Becharath, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. So the tribe is Benjamin. His name is Kish. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. By the way, Saul's height is emphasized at the beginning of the story. When Goliath comes along, he should be Saul's man. You send your biggest guy against their biggest guy, and Saul is a coward, but that's another story for another day. Anyway, Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, and has his dad, his name is Kish. So you come back here to Esther 2 then. Esther 2, and if I can type it in, Esther 2, and you find that Mordecai is a descendant of a man called Kish. Can't be the same Kish historically, but that's a name getting passed down, getting reused within the tribe. Tribe of Benjamin, great-grandson, as it would turn out, of Kish. And the family, probably the reference here is to Kish, would have been the right generation during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. But the family got here how? How did Mordecai's family arrive in Babylon, Persia?
They were taken captive.
Taken captive.
That they defeated Jehoiakim.
Yeah, so Jehoiakim comes over in 597. So when Nebuchadnezzar whips the Egyptians and the Assyrians in 605 BC, he begins a series of deportations throughout the empire, and there are multiple waves of this. So Daniel and his friends are probably one of the earliest waves, maybe 605, maybe 602, 601. And then you have a wave in 597 where Nebuchadnezzar hauls off Jehoiakim and some of the best and brightest. And then your final wave as far as Jerusalem is concerned is 587, 586. The city is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, that kind of thing. So the 597 wave is when Mordecai's ancestors came to Babylon, and then of course when Cyrus takes over Persia, he knocks off the Babylonians. Now he's in charge, so that's how we are here in Persia, is going all the way back to the days of Nebuchadnezzar when Mordecai's family came over. Mordecai's name is the Hebrew version of the Babylonian god named Marduk. So as happens today, in our culture, we have people who will come to the United States from other cultures, and they will take on English names, American names, to be able to fit in. We can pronounce them and interact with them. And that happens in some cases throughout history. And so Mordecai's name is a name that is a Babylonian name. It does not mean he loved or followed the god Marduk. It just means it's a Babylonian-sounding name. And that's the etymology from the god Marduk. Esther, her Hebrew name is what? Hadassah, and Hadassah means myrtle, like flower, like a lovely flower, myrtle. I was in a graveyard one time with my aunt, walking to a graveside service for a distant relative, and there were these little headstones, unbeknownst to me, that were smaller than normal, just little sizes of brick about this big. That's the economical way to go for your headstone. And in each brick was the name, and there was a headstone with myrtle in it. And I was walking along not paying attention, and I tripped over this headstone. And so my aunt and I are trying not to laugh. Once you get Aunt Patty laughing, it's hard to stop. And so we're laughing about this stone, myrtle stone that I tripped over. Different myrtle. Anyway, that you didn't want that story anyway. But Hadassah's name means myrtle. Esther is her alternate name. And Esther, there's a couple different ways of thinking here. It might be related to the word for star in Babylonian or in Persian. Or she might be a name based off of the goddess Ishtar, one of the pagan goddesses of the time. So could be star, could be named after the goddess. At any rate, these are some Jews who have names that are very, they have taken on names that fit with the culture, even though at least in Esther's case, she maintains also her Hebrew name. We don't know what Mordecai's more Jewish-sounding name may have been. We meet them here. We want to notice, though, about these folks, Mordecai and Esther and the stock from which they come. They are captives. They have been carried off against their will from their homeland generations ago, as it turns out at this point. But they are captives taken away against their will, just as the women who we've just read about are being taken, probably largely against their will, to go and be forced into these beauty treatments, and more than likely permanent residence in the king's harem as sex objects but nothing more. That's probably they're against their will, and here we have these folks that are against their will, here against their will, and Esther doubly is an orphan as well. And so we have compassion on Mordecai and on Esther and on these women who are being conscripted into the beauty derby of the king, and that's all part of the stock from which they come. Other questions or comments about these characters?
We talked about,
You and then Bill and then Todd. Yeah.
well, you talked about the names being changed. We've seen that before because that Shadrach, Meshach, and
Sure.
Abednego
Yes.
was
Right.
The Persian names or the Babylonian names for the three Hebrew, and
Right.
Daniel we use his Hebrew name, but he dealt with
Right. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego all were given Babylonian at that point names. Yeah, to assimilate, and this is nothing new. In fact, many of the kings themselves probably carried multiple names because they're jurisdictions, multiple people. Yes, Todd.
Excuse me, this isn't a question so much as maybe an observation, whatever. But this is the known world that we're talking about at the time, right?
Right.
Everybody's in except Greeks. Okay?
Right.
That we go well.
Right, we blew it with the Greeks.
So in an area, in an empire that's that big, there's no way that everything is going to be
Right.
You're going to have all these different ethnicities. Given the emphasis on lineage that the biblical authors put in, son of so and so, son of so and so, son of so and so, back 5, 6, 7, 8 generations, it would seem that at least as far as the Jews are concerned, that ethnicity is really important.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
But our king Ahasuerus here, part of the empire, is fine with me.
Right.
So I just find it like a dichotomy almost that
Yes.
they're just so radically different.
Yes.
But here's Ahasuerus saying, well, here's Esther, she's a Jew, well,
Yeah.
we'll overlook that for my sake, her sake, whatever.
Sure. So a few things are going to happen here. One is that Mordecai and Esther are both trying to keep their Jewishness a secret for a while, which is part of the scandal of this book for some of the Jewish folks trying to decide whether we embrace this as authoritative scripture or not. Why does Qumran not have this in their collection, for example? Because, as you said, throughout the history of the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, ancestry is important. Maintaining our distinctiveness is important, even if we find ourselves far from home in a different kind of empire. And so that is emphasized here. We're going to maintain distinctiveness of who we are. One of the scandals, then, of Esther is just how much compromising, apparently, Mordecai and Esther are willing to engage in socially, ethically, in order to, to accomplish whatever. But clearly, they're interested in maintaining their distinctiveness, and the author of Esther is interested in maintaining that distinction as well. But as far as Xerxes and his predecessors and his successors are concerned, the Persian Empire was more celebratory of ethnic diversity as long as you didn't upset the apple cart. If you upset the apple cart, oppression. We're happy to do that. But violence, whatever. But we're going to be more tolerant of different people groups within the empire as long as you don't cause problems and pay your taxes, which is basically how Caesar works later on in the Roman world, right? So actually, Esther indicates in part, hey, we're going to send out these decrees to all the peoples of the empire, all their languages are going to understand this sort of stuff. So Xerxes is okay with some diversity as long as it's submissive diversity. But as far as the Jewish author is concerned, he wants us to make sure that we know from where these people come and who they're really being loyal to and this sort of thing.
So is this, I guess, an outgrowth maybe of we're the chosen people,
Right.
So right here,
Right.
the Jews
Right.
are chosen people, and sort of you Persians,
Right.
y'all do your thing over there, and
Right.
we'll just be Jewish over here.
So significantly,
Which you can still see some of that, I guess, today, really.
Right. You still have the issue, both Judaism and Christianity today, how much to assimilate or not assimilate with the surrounding culture. But the key issue here in setting the background of Mordecai and of Esther is to seat them broadly within the people of God. This is the people to whom Yahweh made promises and to whom Yahweh remains faithful, and even in the context of the hardships they're going through. And so the events you're about to read are within that heading. These are people who go all the way back to the tribe of Benjamin, King Saul. That is the stock from which they come. And so that helps influence it. Specifically, though, by mentioning Saul, Saul had a run-in with the Agagite, and we're going to find out that Haman is an Agagite later on. So we're bringing back an old, historic, ethnic problem later on here as well. So that's what's going on. We're setting the scene here ethnically and within the history of the people of Israel. Well, let's pray here. A little overtime today at 10:08, but thank you. That was good. So we will pray, and then we'll pick up again, probably verse 5 again next week, and then we'll move on into what happens with Esther. Lord, thank you for this great conversation today. I thank you for what you're bringing to our minds and our hearts. I pray that you shape us. I pray you show us our own anger, show us our own decision-making processes. How do we decide what we decide? What makes a good idea? Who are we listening to for advice? What scandalizes us? What ticks us off, and why? And help us to learn and grow in those ways. And we pray you be Lord of all that. I pray you help us to be your faithful witnesses today in the place where you've put us. It can be hard for us today to be faithful to you and the different things we face. So I pray you help us to be people who reflect your image, your likeness to your glory, and especially your love. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. We'll be back next week for session 4 of Esther and more of chapter 2.